Okay, so welcome everyone to today's GEOTOP-A seminar, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Benedikt Kolbe as today's speaker. Benedikt has a background in pure math from Berlin, where he did his master's at the Humboldt and then his PhD at the Technical University. He has quite a history of international travel and collaborations. His PhD was also joint supervised with John Sullivan and Miff Evans, but also in collaboration with Vanessa Robbins from Australia. And Benedikt is one of the people promoting the link between pure and applied topology in Germany. He has a permanent position now in the University of Bonn, where he's advertising the appeal of applied topology, and he will show us a little bit of this today in his talk on three-dimensional entangled graphs from mapping class groups and approximate persistence computations. Benedikt, take it away.
Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for the organizers for giving me an opportunity to speak here. Well, without further ado, let me just get straight into it. Today I'm going to talk to you about three-dimensional entangled graphs from mapping class groups. I'll leave the second half of the title until later. So we have two parts, basically. First, I will talk to you about how to systematically construct entangled graphs that give rise to chemical structures from embeddings of graphs on special surfaces. Already, this means that we are restricting our attention to certain classes of graphs. And later, I will talk about some ongoing work on algorithms for persistent homology for approximations of barcodes. And of course, I should mention what these two have to do with one another and why I think that it's a good idea to talk to you about both of them, or even work on both of them. So there are main references that I'll just flash here real quick. So this is work that has been ongoing for a while. So the first part, again, is why would and how could one systematically construct graphs on a given surface? And how, another way of saying this is, how does one draw all possible drawings on a surface up to deformations? So let's take a step back and think about the motivation for a moment. Graphs in nature and in material science, they appear as locally finite, simple graphs that are often triply periodic. So for example, there is a sodalite, a prominent zeolite that is important for chemists. And we see here, okay, we have this triply periodic structure that's easy to discern. And the rest of the graph structure is also clear. However, as of yet, that doesn't really help because studying entangled graphs is quite complicated. So even modeling them as these graphs, that doesn't give us that much yet, but that gives us a mathematical framework. So let's take a look at some more pictures. As we can see, quite complicated. On the left, we might have an idea of what is going on. On the right, we don't really. Interestingly enough, though, these pictures have the knots in these pictures have the same symmetry. So we know that it's complicated to study these entangled graphs. However, since we want to use this to model a problem in chemistry, we can use the observation that actually molecular structures in real life, they grow in restricted environments. They don't just grow as random graphs. And often these restricted environments can be modeled as neighborhoods of constant mean curvature surfaces or minimal surfaces. As an example, we take the sodalite from just now, and I hope that you see what I'm trying to show here, namely that the sodalite is really a drawing on this surface here. So this already takes us to the central idea of the EpiNet approach, which stands for Euclidean patterns and non-Euclidean tilings. So that is that we studied entangled graphs by explicit constructions of graphs on triply periodic minimal surfaces. So we want to do this because this will also give us a way to focus on nets that are symmetric in a certain way. which will become clear, which in and of itself is more important for applications. So we have some kind of intrinsically hyperbolic surface in R3, and we draw a graph on there. And then we forget about the surface, which leaves us with this sequence of pictures. So we have a hyperbolic tiling, then the green edges, then we project from the hyperbolic tiling that we see on the left to the surface that is in the middle, and then we forget about the surface, and we get this the zeolite structure from before. So from a mathematical point of view, what was going on here is that we have some metric on this surface. Let's go back here. This surface that's quite prominent here, but easy to understand. It's induced by the ambient metric of R3, and every metric on a surface has an associated uniformized metric. It turns out that in the case of triply periodic minimal surfaces, this is always hyperbolic. That's why that's the important case we are focusing on. And the other cases are really just cases where the genus is either 0 or 1. That's the torus case or the case of the sphere. And when we talk about the hyperbolic plane, I should tell you what model I'm using and why this looked like a disk. Well, this is the Poincaré disk model of the hyperbolic plane. For those of you who don't know, let me just briefly explain what it is. It's a model where the angles that you see in the model correspond to the angles in the hyperbolic plane of geodesics. The distances don't, though. So towards the boundary, we have increasingly distorted distances. And in actual fact, each of these triangles that you see here, it actually has the same size, like also the ones that are closer to the boundary. So that's how we get some idea of how distances are distorted. That doesn't matter though, because this is just a combinatorial model to see what's going on. Then I should tell you that these lines are geodesics, and you can tell because they are circular arcs of circles that intersect the boundary of this unit disk in a right angle. And one cool thing about this model is that a normal circle that is inside a normal Euclidean circle that looks like just a normal circle inside the unit disk actually corresponds to an actual circle in the hyperbolic plane. So let me take you to another place, first of all. So we know now that we're going to talk about these entangled graphs that arise as embeddings of graphs on surfaces. So why is it that I'm interested in these surfaces? Why is it that these surfaces are interesting? We already met this surface on the right earlier with the zeolite example. And then we have the gyroid and the diamond and the primitive triply periodic minimal surfaces. So they're triply periodic and minimal. And they have very neat properties. One is coming from nature. That is that they actually, that the gyroid, for example, it just exists virtually almost everywhere, like in butterfly wings, in bugs. You have these structures inside cells that are made up out of the gyroid and that give these materials some of their properties. So we are focusing on a class of surfaces that actually exists in reality, which is a good starting point. And yeah, I'll leave it at that for now. So how do we get to this picture of the unit disk? Why does it show up when I'm talking about these complicated surfaces? They certainly look more complicated than the unit disk. Well, it's because they're the universal covering space. Here is an easy way of viewing the universal covering space. It's just this is the case for the torus and the case for surfaces with more than one hole. We have more complicated things, and we see here, though, that we have this duality where we can describe a universal covering space as its abstract space or as this tiling. basically. So for the closed hyperbolic surfaces, the universal covering space is just H2. And every time we have a universal covering, we have also a discrete group of isometries of the covering space that if you quotient the covering space by this discrete group of isometries, you get the original surface back, the hyperbolic one. So let's take a look at another example to see how this is going. So we have the hyperbolic plane. We have some edges that are drawn on there that are drawn on the hyperbolic plane in a symmetric way. This leads to a projection of these edges onto one of the triply periodic minimal surfaces. This is just one building block of them. And if we then take copies of this building block to fill out the entire space, and then forget about the surface, we get this. So we get complicated things that nonetheless have where we kind of control over the symmetries that these knots have in R3 by using this construction. And we could also ask about, okay, what does this do? Are we getting a lot of advantages from this point of view or not? And one thing I just want to show you in pictures basically is that it's a lot easier to analyze the structure of nets resulting from the embedding into R3 when you consider them in a 2D setting. So this already gives us something. I'm not going to talk more about this now, but already here we can say, okay, maybe there's some way to salvage persistence computations that take place in this complicated metric space of the hyperbolic plane instead of doing them in R3. Okay, so what problem are we actually addressing? What do I want to talk about today? And that is, well, now we distilled the problem down to doing something with surfaces as opposed to looking at general entangled graphs. And we also want the symmetry to be encoded into our approach. So the question becomes, can we list all symmetric graph embeddings on a triply periodic minimal surface efficiently? Okay, so we view this triply periodic minimal surface as a compact surface in the 3 torus. Then we have a finite topology surface. The uniformization tells us that it's, there are general results that tell us that it's a hyperbolic surface. And the first thing we see, a simple observation, is that if we have 2 graphs embedded on a triply periodic minimal surface, and these are isotopic on the surface, then surely they will also give rise to ambiently isotopic entangled graphs in R3. Because you just have more freedom in R3 to isotope things. We are going to focus on 2-cell embeddings of graphs in this talk because that makes it a lot easier and also easier to talk about. Okay, so what are my goals? My goals is really mostly to show you pictures and to get you interested. So I'm going to do this in the context of introducing the tools necessary to tackle the problem. First, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about combinatorial tiling theory, then introduce something called isotopic tiling theory. We will talk a little bit about orbifolds and mapping class groups. And that will give us a high-level idea of how we can formulate an algorithm that actually enumerates all of the symmetric 2-cell embeddings of graphs on a given surface, on a given hyperbolic surface. The other cases are also possible. They're actually a lot easier than the hyperbolic case. And we will also talk a little bit about implementations. And as I said, we will look at a lot of nice pictures. So to start off with, why minimal surfaces? Why not just take any old surface? And there's actually something crucial happening here. So first, let me tell you, minimal surface, remind you that these are surfaces that minimize locally the surface area relative to the boundary. So this is a minimal surface. And it turns out that many minimal surfaces actually feature a lot of symmetries. And now this is the crucial point. The crucial point is that the internal symmetries usually, and all but basically one transformation, will lift to rigid motions in R3. So if you can also see this in this picture. You see here that these triangles, they show the symmetry of the surface as an abstract manifold. And also it turns out that if you look at these straight lines and you look at a reflection along the plane that contains that cuts this surface in half, then that is also a symmetry of the surface. So even though a priori that had nothing to do with one another, the symmetry of the surface viewed abstractly, and the one that you get by looking at those symmetries that are induced by ambient isometries of R3. And also these exist. You just have lots of minimal surface embeddings that are triply periodic. One could ask, okay, maybe they don't exist, right? So this is not true. Actually, it's funny that mathematicians, I think, until the 90s, they hadn't proven yet that these actually exist, even though natural scientists and other sciences, material science, had talked about them for years, decades even. Okay, so let's get back to our three favorite ones. Three favorite triply periodic minimal surfaces, that is. And we see here that all symmetries are actually a result of symmetries of the shown triangles. You see the triangles here. And all of these symmetries, including the translational symmetries of the periodic surfaces, are just a result of these triangles. So really, we should be talking about these structures in terms of these triangles, which gives rise to the notion of orbifolds. And this is the normal setting that one wants to view this this problem in, just because we have this baked-in requirement that we want to consider isometries or symmetric graph embeddings. So, what are orbifolds? Well, an easy way, and I'm only going to give you like a special case of what an orbifold is. Let's say we have a discrete co-compactly acting group of isometries of the hyperbolic plane. Then topologically, the orbifold is just the quotient space. However, really, we should think of the orbifold as the symmetry group. And it actually turns out that if we have a symmetry group like this, then an isomorphism of the symmetry groups exists if and only if the orbifolds are diffeomorphic. So really think of the symmetry group as the underlying object. And well, that the whole idea of orbifolds really is to look at structures that preserve symmetries, and we see here a couple of examples of tilings. Like all of these are naturally graphs embedded on an orbifold. Let's look at a couple more examples. We have here of things that you can see in bathrooms or in other countries sometimes. Morocco, for example, has these things. There's a picture from Berlin and another one by the artist Escher. And all of these represent orbifolds. Okay, so having talked about orbifolds, what is the setting that I want to talk about tilings? And it is really the setting of equivariant or combinatorial equivalence. And to give you an idea of what this is, really, we are given a tiling together with a symmetry group that leaves it invariant. So this is more than just the tiling, right? We're also given the information of the symmetry group that leaves it invariant. This means that the same tiling can have more encodings as an equivariant tiling. So once one is given this equivariant tiling, then one can encode the equivalence classes of these using this definition. So we have two equivariant tilings. So the tilings with their symmetry groups, they're equivariantly equivalent if there exists a homomorphism of the space that they are tilings of, such that you map one tiling to the other, but you respect the symmetries while doing so. That's the important part. And basically, if you say, okay, let's only consider orientation preserving homomorphisms of the Euclidean plane or the hyperbolic plane, then what you really get is something that tells you if one tiling can be deformed into another while keeping the symmetries intact. here. So we can ask, is this tiling on the left? Can it be transformed into the one on the right? It turns out, yes, it can actually. And it does so while at each step of the way, you can leave the symmetries intact. And I hope that you can see what I'm trying to show here. This is the step-by-step deformation process of the one tiling into the other. Now, why is this interesting? Well, because there is actually a complete invariant, which is a particular colored graph. It's called the D symbol, and you can construct it from a tiling. And if you construct it for another tiling, then these graphs that are the D symbol are there's a graph isomorphism between them if and only if you can deform the one tiling into the other. And when I say deform, I'm talking about the case where this homomorphism is orientation preserving. If it's orientation reversing, you'd need a reflection there. Okay, so that brings us to my first take-home message. My first take-home message is many molecular structures can be modeled as graphs embedded on these trippy periodic minimal surfaces, many that are as important. And these are covered by the hyperbolic plane. And prominent examples exhibit high degrees of symmetry, which means that they are naturally described by overfolds. All of these symmetries, they lift to ambient symmetries of R3. Well, that's where the overfolds comes in. And yeah, there is this complete invariant that classifies these symmetry preserving deformations of tilings, or the equivalence class of the tilings. So let's update our problem. Now we want to say, okay, not just anything like how can we scribble graphs on a surface, but we want to actually list all the isotopy classes of symmetric two-cell graph embeddings on a compact surface of genus that is greater than 1. So interesting to note is that the symmetries of a surface are preserved on uniformization. The graphs, they lift on the surface to the universal covering space, the hyperbolic plane. So really the graphs, they kind of correspond to tilings of the hyperbolic plane that are invariant under some symmetry group. And because of this, so we can enumerate all of these symmetry groups too that are candidates for graphs that are invariant on the surface. And because of this, what we're actually doing is we can actually say we don't have this symmetric two-cell graph embeddings on the compact surface, but really we are dealing with a tiling problem. We're looking at tilings in the hyperbolic plane that are symmetric with respect to some symmetry group. So let's take a look at what this does. So we have here a tiling, and I marked for you 5 two-fold rotations that generate the symmetry group that this tiling is invariant under. And now I can see that actually I can interpret this whole tiling as a result of connecting by geodesics these points appropriately. So geodesic from 1 to 2, from 2 to 3, from 3 to 4, from 4 to 5. And the rest of the pattern is just given. So the idea will be to say, okay, there is some tiling structure that you get by having generators 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, connecting them in a particular way by geodesics, and then enforcing the entire symmetry group. And the result will be some other tiling, but it will turn out that doing so will always give you an actual embedded tiling, which is not obvious, but we can see here in pictures how this works. So see, we have here a completely different tiling, but we have the same combinatorial structure. We have an edge from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, 4 to 5, and then we impose all the symmetries. We get some tiling. And here there's an even crazier one, and they're all the same. So we can describe tilings depending on special generators, say. I'm going to leave that purposely vague, but you can, of course, ask me questions if you have any. So why is this interesting? Of course, we have to first figure out what tilings can actually be described using only geodesics. And well, the first thing we find is that actually any old isotopy class of a tiling has a representative where each edge has at most one kink. However, this is not constructive, so that's not so great. We can go to something constructive, and then we see that if we have a tiling that is simple, then this tiling will always have a geodesic representative, and we can actually construct it explicitly. So that's good. Yes, so we construct these geodesic tilings by having combinatorial descriptions. And well, this description really only defines a tiling up to symmetry preserving isotopes, right? Like we can also connect two of the points that we want to connect with a non-geodesic by wiggling the geodesic a bit, and it will still give you a tiling. So if we start with a different set of generators that act in the same way for the same symmetry group, then if they satisfy the same relations, then there's actually an automorphism of the symmetry group that transforms one of the generators to another. And if we have two conjugate sets of generators, and we take a look at the description of the tiling by geodesics, then if we have conjugate sets of generators, then we get the same tiling. And this is intuitively entirely clear, I want to point out, because here we have the 1, 2, 3, 4, but just take a look. What would happen if a conjugate version of this central tile would mean that we construct the whole tiling from the neighboring tile here. And there we have the same kind of description, so it would give rise to the exact same kind of tiling. Not just the exact same kind of tiling, the exact same tiling. So what we're really interested in is the group of outer automorphisms, because we don't want to consider these conjugate sets of generators. And for those of you who have worked with the mapping class group before, you will see that when you talk about outer automorphisms, like here, then the mapping class groups become a natural candidate of object to study. So defined, I mean, I'm not going to go into a lot of details on the definition of the mapping class group, but really it is all the diffeomorphisms up to deformations of diffeomorphisms. Or said in another way, you have the class of diffeomorphisms, and if there's a path through diffeomorphisms from the one diffeomorphism to the other, then you identify them. So one example of this would be if you look at an annulus and you twist along an annulus. This is a prominent example of a mapping class group. You twist around, then the green curve follows the red curve while still going in the direction that it was going to go. And we can take a look at this twist on a cylinder or an annulus, same thing. Yeah, that's what this looks like. It's just one example. The mapping class group is certainly a pretty complicated object. So why is it important? Well, it turns out that also for orbifolds, and we don't even need the assumption that we have a compact orbifold or a co-compactly acting group. It's enough if it's finite volume, then we get an isomorphism of the mapping class group to a certain subgroup of the group of outer automorphisms. And that's really interesting because that means that we can use the literature on mapping class groups and all the interest that has gone into that to further investigate the setting of these construction of the graphs. So basically, another way to interpret this is we had the outer automorphisms, which encode sets of special generators. So now that this isomorphism means that the mapping class group basically corresponds to special sets of generators. And then something interesting that is quite technical that one has to point out is that if you have a finite covering surface and a graph that is deformable in this finite covering space into another graph, and these project onto different graphs of the covered space, then you cannot deform the top into in the top covering space if you cannot do it in the bottom space. I don't know if I butchered that a bit, but basically what it's saying is you cannot win that much by going to a finite covering space. So how much ambiguity is there if I try to construct tilings by giving just sets of generators? So it turns out that the tilings can be invariant under a non-trivial transformation. There's an example here that kind of looks complicated, but really it tells you that if you have a this tiling that is made of the black edges, or consists of the black edges of this fundamental domain, then having these edges on the right side or having them on the left side doesn't really change the tiling. And they are not conjugates. So that's one thing that can happen. And it turns actually out that that's the only thing that can really happen. If you have tilings that are sufficiently complicated, then really only conjugate generators lead to isotopic tilings. And otherwise, only finitely many things can occur. And not just that, if I give the edge orbits different colors of the tiling, then the only ambiguities that remain are a single reflection. So we have quite strong control over the ambiguities that appear here. So the cool thing that one can, so the one thing that is a bit mysterious here, right? The mapping class group is quite the complicated object. So going over to the mapping class group might seem like I'm not even winning anything. However, it turns out that the action of the mapping class group on these generators, that can be explicitly described. I'm just showing an example. So we have like these marked points on the surface, and then we do what is called a half twist of these 2 points. Then we have the closed curves that generate the fundamental group that follow this half twist, and then we get an algebraic expression of how the generators transform with under the action of the mapping class group. So all you have to do is look at generators of the mapping class group, and then you obtain the entire action of the mapping class group. So this brings us to my second take-home message, and that is that geodesic edges of tiling can be described combinatorially with the help of these special generators of the symmetry group. And different sets of generators are actually associated to an automorphism. And these correspond to automorphisms, really the ones that are important, that give rise to distinct tilings. And really, we can even make more precise the statement of the isomorphism that I had on screen a couple of slides ago. And that is really that in our case, for the compact surfaces, the mapping class group is isomorphic to the group of automorphisms. And this isomorphism can be explicitly constructed. And since there are hardly any ambiguities, yeah, we basically have an opening to try to create all of the embedded graphs. So let's take a look at what this does when I look at these generators of the mapping class group, because if the world was perfect, then I should now have some generators of the mapping class group where I get different sets of generators that are only a little bit different, that are not completely different. And it turns out, so here, I just want to flash this image that we had of like the covering space of the triply periodic minimal surfaces. So this is it. And this is for the primitive, the diamond, and the gyroid surface. And we can see here that a half twist really doesn't change that much. We only move everything in the tiling around a bit. So we have 2 inverse twists, which at least tells us that intuitively what is going on is what we want. So let me update the problem one more time. Now that we have the construction of the graphs in terms of these generators, what we really want is that we enumerate all the elements of the mapping class group up to a certain word length. And really, in general, we even want to enumerate cosets of the mapping class group with respect to finite subgroups. So there's a hope that this can even work. Like if it were more than just finite subgroups, that would be that would be too much to ask for. So we need representations of the mapping class group of orbifolds, I want to point out. So there has been a long history of finding presentations of mapping class groups of classical surfaces, closed surfaces of some genus, and maybe even punctured ones. But that's not the same thing as having the mapping class group of an orbifold. That is a lot more complicated, so one has to actually derive these. Some of the things that are relevant for this is just, I'm just going to name drop a couple of things here. And really, these structures that underlie the computational group theory, really, they are what make this possible. So we have this automatic structure on mapping class groups. I just want to, and without going into too many details, what this is, tell you that there are results that make it possible to even use this whole framework, because it's totally unclear, right? If I say, oh, I have a problem, a geometric problem, I reduced it to solving a group theoretical problem where I have to enumerate group elements, it's absolutely unclear if that was a good thing to do or not. So there are a bunch of things that are unknown about automatic groups. However, it turns out that if we have a mapping class group of an orbifold without reflections, then they have an automatic structure, which we can salvage to get an efficient solution to the word problem and to the enumeration of word elements or group elements. There's something more that we can say, however, without going into too many details. If you have mirror symmetries in an orbifold, the situation is somewhat harder, but there's still something that one can do. So we get to the last take-home message of the first part of my talk, and that is also the greater part of my talk. Mapping class groups are automatic, which is just to say that they behave reasonably well in terms of algorithmic properties. It's very complicated in general. I mentioned this a couple of times. This the nice set of generators was just what I wanted to illustrate with this 1/2 twist that only does a bit. And that also showed that we have some kind of we preserve some of our intuition of what we should get when we just change embeddings a bit. And we basically reduced a geometric problem entirely to an algebraic problem and made it somehow tractable. So yeah, maybe this is a question that we should ask. Let me show you some embeddings that come out of this. So this is just a bunch of pictures. As you can see, we have here the primitive surface, hyperbolic tilings on the top. On the bottom, we have a nets embedded on the surface, and we twist them up, these nets, and we get more and more complicated structures. On the top, the tilings also look more and more twisted. Then there are different minimal surfaces. This is one that I didn't tell you about, but I feel like it shows quite nicely what is going on. As you can see here, we get more and more complicated things by twisting more and more. And when I say twisting, by looking at what I mean is elements of the mapping class group that show up later. And this is a slide that I put in here just to advertise that, as you can see here, this is a bit different from the other situation because the tilings are not compact disks anymore. So the tilings are not bicompact disks anymore. And still, the procedure works. It's just a little more complicated and more technical. So let me summarize part 1. We have structures in 3D. They're quite complicated. However, interesting structures arise from embeddings on nice surfaces that show lots of symmetries. These surfaces, it turns out, are covered by the hyperbolic plane. I can look at symmetric tilings instead of the symmetric graphs. And I can enumerate basically all of these tilings in a systematic way. And why is this interesting? Of course, this is the thing that one has in mind. these are interesting structures, theoretically at least, so it would make sense to have a catalog of all of these that one can sift through when one is checking for certain structures with given physical properties. It would be nice to have like an atlas of possible structures. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention for the first part. Are there any questions? Okay, then let me just thank my collaborators too. There is Vanessa Robbins, Stephen Hyde, and Mifanwi Evans. And now let me quickly tell you, why have I become interested in persistence? Well, of course, I want to analyze these periodic structures, right? What good is an atlas of structures if I don't have a way to actually evaluate if these have a certain property? And that's a very open question, how one could find that out. But even simple topological properties is not entirely clear. So this is where persistence comes in. Let's take a look at the check filtration and just show you how intrinsically interesting it is to actually look at this object. So because the thing is, if we construct the check filtration, then it already gives rise to a fundamental concept for surfaces, which I call half minimizers. The way I like to think of half minimizers, despite this definition here, is really that a half minimizer is the definition is like the best length minimizing structure that a closed curve can have. If you're a closed curve, then you can't globally minimize the length along the curve, obviously, because you're going along the curve and you end up where you started and you're going like a long way. But at least there's something to be said about such a curve being a half minimizer, a concatenation of two length minimizing geodesics. And why is this interesting? Well, because these show up actually in the analysis of Dirichlet fundamental domains. And they have there are isotopic properties of these. But I don't want to go into too many details here. I just want to show you these things to emphasize that the fundamental properties of the surface that one is investigating actually show up, some of them, when one investigates the check filtration and even just the construction. So that's nice. But what do we do with this this check filtration and the construction? So what are we going to do here? The problem is that the filtrations, I mean, this is a problem that many people have, are just too large for many applications. So often one looks for approximations with guarantees. There is an approximation by Sheehy from a bit over 10 years ago that can reduce the size of the check complex to something linear in the number of points. So that's great. Then that means that we can evaluate the barcode there, but we'll get something that is a lot faster, but still it's actually too slow for many applications. So that's also not so great. But the thing is, somehow maybe this idea of trying to study the persistence in a complicated or a more complicated space as opposed to Euclidean space, if you take that at one step at a time, then maybe that gives you something, and we will see that it actually does. So how does one usually go about computing the barcode in one parameter persistence? You set up a boundary matrix, then you do something similar to Gaussian elimination. There is an algorithm that does this in n to the matrix multiplication exponent time. However, there is no subquadratic algorithm known, and there are also no lower bounds. I have this persistence pipeline here. You have the data that comes in, you have the filtration, you have your functor, you decompose. So you have a couple of things that you could do. You could say, okay, the data gives rise to another filtration. This is like the Sheehy approach here, so that you make this simpler, the filtration, so that you can then compute the barcode or the diagram faster. However, that's maybe not the only thing that one can do. Yeah, I just want to point out that it's natural to look at the check filtration, and we have like this way of reducing the size of these filtrations. And there's even something known for the multi-cover filtration that reduces the size to something that is linear in the number of points. And that means that this is certainly an approach that is fruitful. However, if you keep track carefully, then you'll see that we still get something that is not subquadratic in n. So it would be interesting to have something that's at least subquadratic in n. And with that, let me get to the final talk, final part of the talk. I want to thank one of my students here. This is Tim Meyer, who I've done this work with. So let's take a look at an idea that would certainly not work. So we have the idea of maybe uniform sampling. Let's say we have our point set, or set of points. This could be, some discretized version of a knot or something else. And unfortunately, if you do uniform sampling, there might be a part of the space that has an outlier, and that doesn't really work that well. So the way that people have dealt with this is that they required assumptions on the distribution of the point cloud, and that controls outliers to some extent, and then one gets results of convergence when you sample uniformly. Also, I want to point out that outliers are sometimes dealt with using multi-parameter filtrations, and those have different variants. It's not so clear that one just wants to compute the door code. So let's go for a second idea. A second idea might be to use a greedy permutation, furthest first traversal. So this is illustrated here. We start at some point, then we go to the one that is furthest away from that point. Then we go to the point that is furthest away of the points that we have already chosen. And yeah, when we do that, we get some kind of sampling of the point cloud that we started off with. And well, maybe there's something one can do there. So this is actually an approach that has been considered before. But this is like a toy example to get started. And this, in the context of a more complicated geometric setting where we don't have just some space, but we actually have a metric space of a bounded doubling dimension, we will see that we get strong results coming from this greedy permutation. So a doubling dimension, just quickly to remind you, it's the smallest k, such that any ball of some radius can be covered by 2 to the k balls of half the radius. That's illustrated there. For Euclidean space, it's linear in the dimension, and it's usually bounded by log n, but often much smaller. And it is often used as an intrinsic measure of dimensionality for sets of points or a metric space. So this is a key lemma that we have. Actually, it turns out that with the assumption that we have a bounded, or with the assumption of or the quantity of the doubling constant here, the doubling dimension, I should say. Yeah, we basically get this result. This just comes from the fact that we can't pack too many points closely in one ball when for a given doubling dimension. So this tells us, though, I'm skipping through some details, but that we can actually, because of this, basically, this is an analysis. I think what was known was that one can use the greedy permutation, but this analysis was not known. And basically, it tells us that we get an approximation of the barcode of the Vittorius-Rips filtration or the check filtration that is linear in n. Well, that's kind of special, but it actually is not quite as cool as what we get later. But I would just want to point out this is already linear in n, so that's nice. And let's go back to the first idea because this worked so well. Is it really the case that outliers make the uniform sampling approach a hopeless endeavor? Well, let's reinterpret one parameter filtrations as like special cases that show up in more complicated filtrations. So intuitively speaking, right, you have the check filtrations that are somehow contained in the multi-cover bifiltrations, and these are also just a special case of measure bifiltrations. So what is a measure bifiltration? If you haven't seen it before, this is the definition. It's just a so we have the topological filtration here, all the points such that if you put a ball of a given radius centered at that point, and you take a look at the measure of that, then it has to at least be as large as the parameter rho. So this is just why can I say that the multi-cover bifiltration is a special case of this? Because, well, if I take this particular measure, which is the sum of direct measures, then it recovers the multi-cover bifiltration. So why is this interesting? Well, it's interesting because it puts the focus on measures. And when you put the focus on measures, then you can take a look at a particular distance of measures, which is the Prokhorov distance. And why would I be interested in the Prokhorov distance? It's because whatever the definition exactly is, not that important at the moment, it is important that it metrizes weak conversions of measures. Why is that important? Well, intuitively speaking, that means that if something is close on the Prokhorov distance, then then the measures can't be too far apart, which basically tells us, okay, maybe there's some way of uniformly sampling and actually getting some results, not for the check filtration then with the barcode, but for the measure bifiltration with the Prokhorov distance. And that's exactly what happens. Only this time, we have to take a look at the support of the measure that we're given. And if it has bounded doubling dimension, then we have nice things that happen. I mean, here is just generally speaking given as delta, but then we can actually uniformly sample. And we get a bound on how bad the variance and the mean can be with respect to the number of points that we sample and depending on the doubling dimension. So this is the same thing. This is but what do we get from there? We actually get from there that if we have any Prokhorov stable invariant of n points, okay, so that can be computed from a measure bifiltration of these n points. And let's say that it's computable, just as an example, in O of n to the p time. Then it actually turns out that we can uniformly sample only this many points, which is independent of n, I want to point out. And then on there, you use this algorithm, and you get with high probability an epsilon approximation of the invariant that one is interested in this time, which is independent of n completely. So that is an interesting thing that happens. And before I end, I just want to say that there is work in progress. This is not quite done yet, where we try to also show a lower bound for the for approximations of the barcode of the check filtration. And well, we think that actually we can find this a lower bound for check filtrations when you for approximating them for arbitrarily small epsilon, if one doesn't have the assumption that the set of points has bounded doubling dimension. So that kind of tells us that we can't really hope for a better thing than our maybe naive approximation, or we can maybe, but we can't hope for one that is valid in all generality for point sets that have unbounded doubling dimension. Say. Yeah, so interestingly enough, the greedy permutation approximation is actually valid whenever the doubling dimension is not log n, but just a bit smaller. And yeah, let me just tell you what my take-home message is, so you remember some of my talk. So this is just the take-home message for the last part. There are subquadratic, even linear approximations possible for arbitrary epsilon for point sets of bounded doubling dimension for check and Vittori strips. Uniform sampling actually tells us something important when we look at the measure filtrations. And well, we think that it is not possible, or likely not possible, to approximate for general point sets where the doubling dimension is log n. And yeah, I'd like to point out that if you're interested in this massive data setting, basically where the quadratic, or not even quadratic, but the cubic runtime of the standard reduction algorithm is prohibitive somehow, then yeah, you should be interested in this massive data setting. And yeah, so unfortunately, this is basically the story of how I got interested in persistence through looking at hyperbolic space and wanted to use it in hyperbolic space. And then I found out that doing it even for a doubling space, well, while it works, that might be the limit of what one can do. And hyperbolic space is, well, famous for not being doubling at all. So that's unfortunate. And with that, I would like to thank you and the organizers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks a lot for this very interesting talk, two-part talk. Do we have any questions from the audience? Please, if you have a question, maybe just raise your hand or maybe unmute your microphone and speak up.
Benedikt, is Renzo here. I like very much your talk. I have two very naive questions. So sorry for being so naive indeed. One regards, in a sense, relationship with physics, and the other is just the simple questions about pure maths. About the physics, you talked, I mean, all you showed, that the first part of your talk was about the relevance, I mean, the construction of tiling, etc., based on the reference on triply periodic surfaces, minimal surfaces. I would like to have a sense of, maybe you said it, how often, thinking in terms of materials and molecular structures, how likely is that you can embed the physical structures on a triply periodic surface? And the second question is very, very simple. I think you showed 3 examples of triply periodic surfaces. Is there a classification? Are these 3 examples somehow covering all we know about triply periodic surfaces? Thank you.
2 excellent questions. So the first one is, so I can say this for both actually. There are aspects to both questions that are just wide open. But having said that, there is of course still something that one can say. So the first question is, okay, so there are these, there's the question was, how often does it actually happen that a chemically interesting structure shows up as something that is embedded on these surfaces? And this is a question that has received some attention in the context of the EpiNet project, simply because that's, well, at the heart of the project. So yeah, I don't have a comprehensive answer for you. What I can tell you, though, is that every now and then also chemists have talked to me about this, and they have said, wow, I was surprised that this structure also shows up on a triply periodic minimal surface. So this is more anecdotal. People are again and again surprised that their structures show up as graph embeddings on a triply periodic minimal surface. Many structures do, not all of them. there is no known classification. So that's the first question. The second one is with regards to the classification of triply periodic minimal surfaces, if I understood correctly. And there's a lot to be said there. A prominent person who has worked in this field is Meeks, is his name, and he
Sure. Famous.
yes, famous, exactly. And one of his results shows that minimal surfaces are unknotted, is a nice way of saying it. What it basically means is that all these, if you're given so you have your triply periodic minimal surface, you have the same genus of the underlying surface that gives rise to them, then they can be deformed into one another while keeping in the three torus, basically. So that's that is possible. However, one thing that doesn't account for, which basically means that we still have to consider more than one of these surfaces, is that really an important aspect of why chemists might be interested in these structures is that they are embedded on these surfaces that are highly symmetric. They do not have, the graphs on this one surface might not be symmetric on the other, if that makes sense. You can have, you can deform the whole surface into the other surface. But if you have a symmetrically embedded graph on the one surface and then you deform the surface into the other, it's not clear, and it also doesn't happen in general, that that you could take the symmetries with you, basically. That you get something that is nice and symmetric in the other surface. So just from the point of view of symmetries, it still makes sense to distinguish them, I would argue.
Thank you. Very, very, very interesting. I'm also thinking, as evident in mentioning minimal area surfaces, that evident from a physicist or a chemist viewpoint, maybe there is something related to minimal energy in terms of physics. And that's maybe why certain structures are easily embedded on a triply periodic minimal surface. Might be because their structure configuration is optimally discussed in terms of energy, some kind of energy.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. Yeah. So it happens that equipotential surfaces that appear in nature, they are often constant mean curvature surfaces.
Yeah.
So
thank you. Thank you.
We also have a question from the online audience. Yanis Tsigikakis was asking for your reference before your take-home message, probably the second slide with the take-home message.
Is it
towards the end?
I had a couple of take-home messages.
Yeah, I think I would guess it was the last one. Yeah.
Me too, from the time.
And then there was a reference. So this, which paper is this by?
That's the paper where he establishes the equivalence between computing the Betti number of a complex and the rank.
This is joint work with Salman Parsa, I think.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. You're right. I should probably.
All right. Okay. Do we have any further questions? Maybe I also have one. If you could go 2 slides back, there was some remarkable statement where, this independent of n. So so the second time is the point. What's independent of n is the time constant for this statement, right? Although in the first sentence you do have a dependence on n still, right?
So this is the setting, right? Like one thing that I said here was that where is it? Okay, I went back too far here, but this is it. If you're in the multi-parameter filtrations case, maybe focusing on one invariant is a good idea. Maybe it's not. We have something that basically works for any stable invariant. Has to be stable for this to work. So you have a stable invariant, and it's just your endpoints, and then you can just uniformly subsample. And intuitively speaking, what is going on is really that one has these measures that are considered under in their distance apart with the Prokhorov distance, and yeah, we get that they're close together, and because the Prokhorov distance metrizes the topology of weak convergence of measures, that is really what gives us this this opening that we can then exploit to say that uniformly sampling does tell us something. Sorry.
Sorry, no, I missed a few words. The connection was just interrupted. Regarding the stability statement, so this is really just Prokhorov stability. I mean, I just wonder, since you mentioned multi-parameter filtrations, if this somehow ties in with the Gromov-Prokhorov stability established by Lesnik and Bloomberg.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. This is something that we want to look at. If we can say something more about the Gromov-Prokhorov setting. Yeah, exactly. I can't really say that much at this time, but I know that that's something that would be interesting to look at.
Okay. All right. Any further questions from the audience, maybe? If not, then let's all thank Benedikt again for this very nice talk. And I'll hand over